Welcome back to Hoochos. Today on Hoochos, we're going to be looking at multiple potato experiments that have been undertaken over the past couple of years by myself, a couple of which you've seen parts of in my updates video, but I never fully showed you how to set up these experiments, and we've seen some of the yields, but I'm going to do a comprehensive hydroponic potato experiment video here. At the end, I'm setting up a brand new system using what I've learned from last year's winter crop, and we're going to set that up with a brand new 3D print. However, this one is also able to be made without 3D printing for those of you who don't have 3D printers. But first of all, I'm going to show you how I set up last year's potato crop. We're going to do a time lapse of that crop, and I'll show you a bit of the yield that I gained and how successful it actually was. This build was originally the chicken grass fodder system, which is a system based upon the rain gutter grow system. And as you can see here, I'm cutting channels into pallets and making a wooden frame for around the pallets to give me 2 1 square meter grow bed areas. There are more in-depth videos about how to build the rain gutter grow system and the chicken grass fodder system on my channel. It's a wicking system that wicks up from the gutter in the middle and is topped up by a float valve which is put at one of the ends. Here I'm just laying out some PVC pond liner and some geofab so that the roots of the grass actually have something to grip onto when I put down the cocoa and perlite. As you can see, I've laid out net cups so that the perlite and cocoa wicks up from down in the gutter. That is just connected to a gravity-fed reservoir containing nutrient, and that automatically tops up the system from the float valve at one end. I just used a 60-40 mixture of cocoa perlite, and that gave me a nice wicking substrate which would supply and maintain the nutrient to the grass in the chicken fodder system. The system actually worked really well. The reason I abandoned the idea is because it's just not financially viable, and for the amount of nutrition that it gave the chickens, I just couldn't see it paying itself off. So I decided to abandon this concept in favor of using the system for something completely different. Having successfully failed at creating a chicken fodder system that was budget friendly, I decided to reuse the bed for hydroponic potatoes. Now, I actually had no idea what I was doing at this stage, and I wanted to create a bed that would wick up and that I could also hill the potatoes. That basically means that once the potatoes push through the mulch that I'm going to lay over the top of them, I keep adding mulch. This method is actually meant to allow the potatoes to push out tubers all the way up their stem. So it was the same setup. I just used a 60-40 cocoa perlite, and I laid the potatoes out over the surface of the substrate, and then I just added mulch to the top. As the potatoes grew and I added more and more mulch, I planned on adding sides to this system so that I could hill the potatoes up. And here we have the hydroponic potatoes. Now they're starting to die back. I'm pretty sure that within a month I'll be able to do a full harvest. But what I want to do right now is I want to do a prelim harvest where we can see what the early season potatoes will look like before the plants have completely died back. So I'm just going to start emptying it out, essentially, trying not to damage the plants too much. This is fairly interesting. This is kind of what I wanted to happen, but it didn't really work out. As you can see, there's a potato developing on the stalk of this plant. Now, what I actually wanted to happen was for the potatoes to develop all up the stalk of the plant, and that hasn't happened. And I think it's because of the density of the material that I'm covering up the stalks with. You can see this here. That is the root of a potato. Those are the developing potatoes on the end of that root. That is interesting. That's really cool, actually. Let's have a look at the base of these plants, what's happening. I'm getting into the roots now, and there's the first potato. Look at that. Lots of potatoes there. Look at that. So what I'm actually going to do is, I might just remove this whole plant. So I'll figure out where this plant is. And this is just one of the potato plants, one of the many that I planted. You can see all of the potatoes, you know. These are from this plant over here. These have all come from one potato in here. And I'm just going to remove it. So I'll just lift it. And that is a hydroponic potato plant. Look at that. Oh, that's pretty cool. I might just remove the larger potatoes like that. I wonder if we replanted it with the smaller potatoes on it. Yeah, I might do that. So I'll replant him, cover him up with the cocoa. Okay, so obviously a better way to do this is to not remove the whole potato plant, but I wanted to show you what was going on down here. I wanted to show you the plant itself. So I'm going to plant this in the hopes that it will continue rooting and drawing up nutrient and creating more potatoes, or at least making the ones that it's got bigger. The only reason I removed the mulch is to show you what's going on down at the media level of this system. And it's actually given me some idea of what this extra mulch has done, which is not particularly much at all. I would need a heavier substrate, I think, to make them put out potatoes on the sides of the potato plants. If you were going to make this system, I'd probably recommend just sticking to maybe the one level of mulch over the top of your cocoa. The potatoes have tended to spread out over the top of the cocoa rather than down in the cocoa, as far as I can tell here. So all I'm going to do now is I'm just going to rob the plants next door of their large potatoes, like so, and I'm going to leave any smaller potatoes on the plants. They can continue growing and supplying the smaller potatoes with more nutrients so that I can have another harvest later when they die back completely. So I'm just going to feel around, and we'll just rob these plants of any large potatoes that are nearby, like that. I'm doing pretty well. I'll get a bowl. And I'm just going to go through and see what I can get from the other potato plants. This is legitimately like fossicking. Potato fossicking. So these ones are smaller. I'm gonna leave those. So I actually don't need any more potatoes than that. I think I've harvested maybe 1/8 of the bed. All right, so we'll weigh now. Why not? Tear it, and we'll add in our potatoes. 1966. So 2 kilograms. 2 kilograms of potatoes. And they're going to be really easy to wash because that growing media is just going to wash right off. Let's do a full harvest on the potato system. It's died right back, and I want to get those potatoes out. So I'm going to remove all this mulch. I'm going to do my best to leave the potatoes down in the grow media so I can show you what it looks like. Now this is pretty exciting. I'm just moving away all the mulch, and look at all those potatoes. That's what it looks like underneath the mulch. I'm gonna go pull back the rest of the mulch, and we're gonna collect up all the potatoes and weigh them. All right, now that I've got most of the mulch off the top, I'm just gonna go through and collect all the potatoes. Then we can weigh them up. So there are a few rotten ones. Okay, so I've been through all of the cocoa and I've got almost an entire 20-litre bucket full of potatoes. I'm now gonna wash them and then we can weigh them. No scrubbing here. Look at that. So easy. All right, so I've weighed the bucket. The bucket weighs about 800 grams, 10.5 kilos. So if we add on our 2 kilos from our other harvest, just under 12 kilos of potato from 2 square meters. If I hadn't had a few rotted ones, I'd definitely be over that if I hadn't left them in the system so long. Very nice. So the yield from that potato crop actually exceeded my expectations. I actually thought that the hydroponic technique would be too moist for the crop and I'd have a heap of rot in those potatoes, but it was only 1 or 2 potatoes throughout the whole system that rotted due to excess moisture, and I think that that was because I left the crop too long. So this method of placing potatoes on the top of the cocoa and perlite works really well. The way that I set that system up was not originally intended for the potatoes to start with. It was also a little bit too complex for what I'd like, but this next system I've designed is so that anyone with a flat piece of land can set up a frame and just drop an auto valve into a grow environment. So it's just coming on winter here in the southern hemisphere, and that's the perfect time for us to plant some potatoes. So the idea is the same again here. I'm not planning on hilling these potatoes again because it didn't really result in any extra tubers up along the stem of the potato. We're going to use this bed, which I built in the float box hydroponic system build. Basically, the way that I built this bed was I made sure that the ground was level. I built a frame with miniature star pickets to hold the sides in, and then I laid out some pond liner and stapled it around the edge so that I've got a nice reservoir for what at the time was meant for the float box, but will now be our potato system. For this system, I've actually designed a 3D print, and I'll show you that now. Now, because I don't want the cocoa and perlite to be as saturated as with the float box, I've decided to go for a different method of refilling this system. This is a smart valve. Now, AutoPot makes these for their AutoPots, and it actually allows for a wet and dry period. So the auto valve will kick in, it will fill the bed with nutrient up to a point, and then it will turn itself off, and the plants will utilize the nutrient until the nutrient level drops to a certain point, and then this will refill it up to about 1/2 inch of depth. It allows you to do really shallow floods in a wet and dry cycle. To put this in this system so that I can have one float valve, these are actually fairly expensive, about $25 for a piece of plastic. To house this float valve, we're actually going to use this. This is a very similar design to the float box hydroponic system. I've just shortened it out. Inside there is a tab that the float valve actually fits onto. This part here will actually just slide over the top. So to make it work, we slide the back end, the 4mm tubing that comes off the back through, push it down over the protrusion at the bottom, and it holds the float valve in place so that it doesn't float up and down when the bed is flooding. This will allow me to use this one float valve for the whole bed, which is going to be extremely budget friendly. So in the time that I've left it, it's accumulated some stuff in the bottom, so I'm going to clean it out. Then we can fill it up with cocoa perlite and get the system running before we put our potatoes in it. So now that our bed's clean, I'm not particularly worried about a little bit of dirt in there. Potatoes generally grow in dirt anyway. I'm going to fill it up with cocoa perlite. Obviously this much area is going to take a lot of cocoa perlite to fill up. I'm going to be reusing cocoa perlite from more expensive crops like tomatoes that I've got left over from grows with them. So this is all the cocoa perlite left over from the round pipe rain gutter grow system buckets. My prediction is I'm going to have a ton of tomatoes pop up from this mix. So I've used 10 buckets, the other 3 over there, and there's about 15 litres in each because they weren't all filled to the top. So I think I've used about 150 litres. A cheap way to do this is to buy the bricked cocoa that makes up 90 litres, and then you would just add in perlite. They're relatively cheap, but they will need to be amended for hydroponics. So you'll need to amend them with calcium and magnesium so that you don't get nutrient lockout from the excess of potassium. Look that up online for now, and I'll have a video coming out eventually about amending cocoa. Because I know that someone in the comments is going to point out the fact that the boxes already exist for these valves, I'd like to point out that the boxes already exist for these valves. I just don't like their design. They've got a mesh on the bottom and that's it. It's really fine and can break fairly easily. There's no holes on the side to let any of the nutrients out. And this is what it looks like on the inside. You can see here the part that holds down the auto valve. And yeah, I just don't particularly like it. So I made my own. However, this might actually be better for this application because of the mesh. So I'll let you know how it goes, but these holes may let in cocoa into our valve box. So to hook up this smart valve, you're gonna need a length of your 4mm piping. We're gonna run it through the hole in the box first because it doesn't fit unless you run this hose first. Put it over the tab on the bottom and that will hold the valve down. This is going to fit in our bed. I'm gonna place it in the middle and we can just fill around it. That is pretty much it for the valve side of things. Connecting it up to our res, we have a couple of options. So this hose here is feeding all of my other systems and it is charged with nutrient. I've turned it off at the moment. What you could do is you could just put a 4mm barb straight into that hose and have it feed directly. Now, because I like to punish myself, I'm actually going to put a connection into it so that I can disconnect it if I want to. This will allow me to do maintenance on the valve if I need to without having to cut the line. This is a 4mm to hose connection. These are extremely rare and I picked this up in the irrigation section of my Bunnings, but yeah, they're really hard to find. So what I'm going to try and have for you is one of these that's 3D printable, and I'm really excited to get this part 3D printable because I'm going to adapt a ton of systems so that we can just have the click connect system on everything, and that will make everyone's life just a heap easier. So I'm just going to connect this 4mm tubing and connect this to this hose, put in a T-piece like so, and then a small bit of hose that can house my quick connect. I know I'm putting a ton of fail points in, but forgive me. And I can just click that on like so, and our valves all connected up. So I'm about to turn that valve on. It's on. You can see down the side we've got the water filling into our box. So that should fill the system very slowly through a 4mm hose. So I'll let that fill and then we can plant out our seed potatoes. Okay, you'll have no idea how hard it was to find seed potatoes slightly early in the season. I actually did go to my local nursery and they'd sold out of theirs, and Bunnings hasn't received theirs yet. So I bought these online. These are Sebago seed potatoes, and I've got about, I reckon there's 45. I think there's 15 in each packet, and I've got 3 kilos. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to lay out the potatoes in a nicely spaced arrangement. So to get them as evenly spaced as possible, and just tip the bags out in each third of the hydroponic system, I can sort of gauge the appropriate spacing. And now I can just space them evenly. And now I'm just going to cover up the lot with sugarcane mulch. Now I would have preferred lucerne because it breaks down a little better into something that's more utilizable for the plants, but because it's hydro, it doesn't really matter. Hopefully I'll only need one bale, but I've got a second just in case. So I'm just gonna do a loose layer over the top, just enough to cover it and protect it from anything that wants to eat the potatoes. And just for good measure, I'm going to put another bag on there. Okay, so it's been 24 hours and I've left this system to its devices. I did not water it in. Now we can check whether the float valve up the other end is providing enough nutrient to keep this cocoa moist. Pull this back and you can see our seed potatoes there. So if we pull that back, we can see the nutrient is not pooling at the bottom, but the cocoa is still moist with nutrient. So the nutrient is definitely accessible to the potatoes in this cocoa, but it's not overly saturated. So we still have a wet substrate, but it is super oxygenated and not oversaturated. So I'm really happy with how this system is supplying nutrient 24 hours on. So this is a fantastic system because it's relatively simple to set up. You can do it with or without a 3D printer, and it gives you an opportunity to reuse cocoa that you might otherwise just throw in your garden bed after you've utilized it in other systems such as the float box or any of the rain gutter grow systems. So I'll be giving you updates on this system as we progress through the winter months of this year, and I'm really excited for another hydroponic potato growing season. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Hoochos. Happy hydroponicking, and I'll see you next time on Hoochos.